right, scuba enthusiasts and curious minds, ready to dive in.
Always ready.
Today we're going deep, no surprise there. Right.
Always going deep on this show.
But I mean that literally. We're talking nitrogen and how it behaves under pressure. Specifically, why understanding this is so important for a safe ascent.
Music to my ears. That's like the golden rule of diving, right? Gotta respect those ascent.
For sure. It's something every diver hears about, but we're going beyond the you got to do it,
Yeah.
getting into the why.
Love it. The why is always way more interesting. So where should we start?
Well, we know air is mostly nitrogen, right? Like almost 80%.
78 to be exact.
Right, 78%. So what happens to all that nitrogen when we go into water?
Ah, the big question. Well, think about it this way. The deeper you dive, the more the water pressure increases.
Right, basic physics.
Exactly. But that pressure doesn't just affect us, it affects everything, including the air we breathe underwater, that nitrogen we talked about. It actually starts dissolving into our blood and tissues because of that pressure.
Okay, hold on. Dissolving. Like how sugar dissolves in water.
Kinda, yeah. But a better analogy might be a soda bottle. You know how when you open a soda bottle really fast, it fizzes up?
Yeah, it makes a mess too sometimes.
Exactly. And it's those gases that were dissolved in the liquid coming out of solution, right?
Okay, starting to see where you're going with this.
So sealing that soda bottle under pressure, that's kind of like being underwater. Everything's chill, stable, until...
Until you crack open that soda and boom,
Mhm.
fizzy explosion.
Exactly. And those bubbles, think of them as nitrogen bubbles forming in your body if you ascend too fast after a dive. And trust me, those nitrogen bubbles ain't as refreshing as a cola.
Definitely not the kind of bubbles I'd want in my veins. That's what leads to decompression sickness, right?
Bingo. You got it. The bends, as some people call it.
So how do we prevent that? Because obviously we got to come back up to the surface.
Of course. We're not meant to live underwater, sadly. But yeah, the key is a controlled ascent as we go up, and that pressure decreases.
The little nitrogen molecules are like, let me out of here.
That's a great way to put it. They get all irritable, wanting to escape our tissues. Go too fast, and boom, just like your soda, you get bubbles.
And those bubbles are the problem.
It's a bit more nuanced than that. It's not just any bubbles. We're talking size and quantity here. Small ones, we call them microbubbles. Those are normal.
We actually want microbubbles.
To an extent, yes. It's the body's way of gently off-gassing the extra nitrogen.
Okay, so small bubbles, no problem.
Yeah.
What about the bigger ones?
Ah, now those are the troublemakers. Those are macro bubbles.
And those form if we ascend too quickly.
Right.
Hence the whole slow and steady thing.
You've got it. Those smaller bubbles can actually combine to form those larger, more problematic ones.
And those can cause some serious issues, right?
Big time. Block blood vessels, put pressure on nerves, all the bad stuff that leads to decompression sickness.
So I've always heard the magic number is 9 meters per minute for a safe ascent rate. Why 9? Who decided on that?
It's not magic, though it kind of feels that way when you're learning, right?
Totally. Like, what's so special about 9 meters?
Well, it comes down to research. Decades of it, actually. Scientists and diving experts figured out that 9 meters per minute is the sweet spot that lets our body release the nitrogen safely.
So go faster,
Yeah.
and our bodies are like, whoa, too much, too fast.
Exactly. That 9-meter mark is like our body's own internal pressure gauge. It can only off-gas so much nitrogen at a time.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about how fast we ascend, there's also the safety curve.
You're on fire today. Yes, the safety curve is crucial.
But I'll admit, the safety curve always sounded a bit mysterious to me.
A lot of divers feel that way. It's really just a guide to help prevent your body from absorbing too much nitrogen in the first place. Think of it like your underwater time limit at different depth.
So the deeper we go, the less time we have. Like our time is on loan from the ocean.
You got it. Deeper you go, the greater the pressure, and the faster your body absorbs nitrogen.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So how does all this work in practice?
Dive tables. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Oh, yes. Dive tables.
Hmm.
Those were essential during my scuba training. Can you tell us more about what those are and how they work?
Sure. They're basically the safety curve put into practice. They tell you, based on your depth and how long you're there, if you can ascend directly or need to make stops on the way up.
Right. Decompression stops, as they're called.
You got it. Those stops give your body time to release that built-up nitrogen so those bubbles don't form.
So dive tables take the mystery out of the safety curve.
Exactly. They make it practical.
And they can literally be life-saving.
No doubt about it.
So we've talked about how nitrogen affects our bodies in terms of decompression sickness. But there's this other thing, right? Nitrogen narcosis. Like it messes with our brains at depth.
Ah, nitrogen narcosis. It's a wild one.
It is. So tell us what's going on there. Why does nitrogen make us feel like we've had one too many cocktails at depth?
It's all about the pressure again. At deeper depths, usually past 30 meters or so, the nitrogen starts to act a little funny.
Funny how.
Well, it starts to affect our central nervous system. It can make you feel euphoric, giddy even, but also it impairs judgment, kind of like having a few drinks.
That doesn't sound very safe when you're underwater.
It's not, which is why recognizing the signs is so important.
What kind of signs should divers be looking out for?
Well, it varies from person to person, but things like feeling lightheaded, having tunnel vision, even feeling overly confident or silly, those can all be signs.
So basically, if you start feeling too happy-go-lucky at depth, it's time to ascend.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry.
Good advice. And speaking of things that can affect us at depth, we also have to talk about oxygen toxicity.
Ah, yes. Oxygen toxicity. That's another fascinating one.
It sounds kind of counterintuitive though, right? Like how can oxygen, which we need to breathe, be toxic?
It all comes back to that concept of partial pressure we were talking about earlier.
Right. It all links together. So break it down for us. What's happening with oxygen toxicity?
Well, at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is pretty low, around 21%. But as we descend...
It goes up, just like with nitrogen. And at a certain point...
Exactly. It gets too high, and that's where the problems can start.
So how deep do you have to go for oxygen to become a problem?
For most recreational divers, it's not something they need to worry about too much. Oxygen toxicity usually becomes a concern at depths greater than 56 meters, which is far beyond where recreational divers typically go.
That's good to know. But for those who do venture into those deeper depths, what happens when oxygen becomes toxic?
It mainly affects the central nervous system, causing all sorts of problems. You can experience things like visual disturbances, ear ringing, even seizures in severe cases. It's serious stuff.
Wow, it sounds like there's a delicate balance to maintain.
Absolutely. Diving's all about respecting those limits and understanding the science behind it.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about nitrogen narcosis, decompression sickness, oxygen toxicity. It's amazing how much there is to learn about diving safely.
Right. It's a constant learning process, but that's what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely. Now, before we surface from this deep dive into the world of nitrogen and its effects on our bodies, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners remember?
If you take away one thing from our conversation today, it's that knowledge is power, especially when it comes to diving.
Couldn't agree more. And listeners, here's something to think about. We've been talking about how even slight changes in depths can affect us while diving. But what about other situations where air pressure changes? Have you ever flown in an airplane or driven up a mountain and felt that pressure in your ears? It makes you wonder how else these subtle changes in pressure might be affecting us in our everyday lives, right? Something to think about. Until next time, dive safe, everyone.
Okay, so the safety curve sounds like a pretty important concept for divers to understand.
It's essential. Think of it like this. It's basically your underwater time limit at different depths.
So the deeper we go, the less time we have to hang out.
Exactly. The deeper you go, the greater the pressure and the faster your body absorbs nitrogen.
It's like the ocean's giving us a time limit for exploring its depths. In a way, yes. And that's where the safety curve comes in. It helps us stay within those time limits and avoid absorbing too much nitrogen.
So how do we actually put this safety curve into practice?
That's where dive tables come in.
Right, dive tables. Those were like my Bible during scuba training.
They're a diver's best friend. Dive tables basically translate the safety curve into practical information. They tell you how long you can stay at a certain depth without needing to make decompression stops during your ascent.
Decompression stops.
Yeah.
Those are the planned pauses we make at shallower depths during our ascent, right?
Exactly. They give our bodies time to release that excess nitrogen, gradually preventing those larger bubbles from forming.
So it's like hitting the pause button on our ascent to let our bodies catch up.
Precisely. And dive tables tell us exactly when and where we need to hit that pause button based on our dive profile.
Dive profile meaning our depth and how long we stayed there.
You got it. It takes all of that into account to calculate our no decompression limit, basically how long we can stay down without needing those extra stops.
It's amazing how much goes into planning a dive safely.
It's all about respecting those limits and understanding the science behind it all. And that's what helps keep us safe in the underwater world.
Speaking of staying safe,
Yeah.
There's another effect of nitrogen under pressure that we need to talk about, nitrogen narcosis.
Ah, nitrogen narcosis, the martini of the deep.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
What exactly is happening in our bodies when we experience nitrogen narcosis?
Well, at deeper depths, typically beyond 30 meters or so, the increased partial pressure of nitrogen starts to affect our central nervous system.
So it's not just in our heads, it's actually altering our brain chemistry,
Exactly. It's like the nitrogen starts acting as a sort of anesthetic.
an anesthetic. So that
Yeah,
explains the feeling of euphoria and lightheadedness that people often describe.
you got it. Some people even compare it to the feeling of being tipsy or drunk.
That sounds a little unnerving, to be honest, especially when you're underwater and surrounded by potential hazards.
It definitely can be, which is why recognizing the signs early on is crucial.
What kind of signs should divers be looking out for?
It can vary from person to person, but common signs include things like feeling lightheaded or euphoric, having tunnel vision or impaired judgment, and even experiencing difficulty concentrating.
So basically, if you start to feel a little too happy-go-lucky at depth, it's time to ascend.
Exactly. And usually those effects wear off pretty quickly as you ascend to a shallower depth.
That's good to know. Are there any other things divers can do to minimize the risks of nitrogen narcosis besides ascending?
Staying well hydrated before a dive can help. And of course, avoiding alcohol or any other drugs before diving is essential, as those substances can exacerbate the effects of nitrogen narcosis.
Makes sense. It's all about being in the best possible physical and mental state before you descend.
Exactly. And of course, proper training and experience are crucial for recognizing and managing the risks of nitrogen narcosis.
It's incredible how much we have to learn about our bodies and how they react to these underwater environments.
It's a whole other world down there with its own set of rules and challenges.
Speaking of challenges, there's one more effect of diving deep that we need to discuss, and it involves the very air we breathe, oxygen toxicity.
That's right. Even oxygen, which we need to survive, can become toxic at certain depths.
Okay, now that sounds counterintuitive.
hmm
How can something we need to breathe be harmful?
It all comes back to that concept of partial pressure.
Right. The deeper we go, the higher the partial pressure of everything, including oxygen.
Exactly. And at a certain depth, the partial pressure of oxygen can become high enough to actually be toxic to our bodies.
So how deep do we have to go for oxygen to become a problem?
For most recreational divers, it's not something they need to worry about too much. Oxygen toxicity usually becomes a concern at depths greater than 56 meters.
Which is far deeper than recreational divers typically go.
Exactly. But it is something that technical divers who venture into those extreme depths need to be very aware of.
So for those extreme divers, what happens when oxygen becomes toxic?
It mainly affects the central nervous system, causing a range of symptoms, from visual disturbances to convulsions and even seizures in severe cases.
That sounds pretty intense.
It can be very serious, which is why technical divers take extensive precautions, including using specialized breathing gases with lower concentrations of oxygen to mitigate those risks.
So it's all about managing those partial pressures and staying within safe limits.
Absolutely. Diving is all about respecting those limits and understanding the science behind it. That's what allows us to explore these incredible underwater environments safely and responsibly.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of nitrogen and oxygen and how these gases affect us at depth.
It's amazing how much there is to learn about the underwater world.
It really is. Now, for all our listeners out there who are eager to explore the ocean depths, what's the one key takeaway you hope they remember from our conversation today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that knowledge is power. When it comes to diving, understanding the science behind it all can literally mean the difference between a safe and enjoyable experience and a potentially dangerous one.
Well said. And listeners, here's a final thought to ponder as you resurface from this deep dive into the world of diving science. If even slight changes in depth can affect us so dramatically while diving, what about those other situations where air pressure changes? Think about it. Have you ever flown in an airplane or driven up a mountain and felt that pressure in your ears? It makes you wonder how else these subtle changes in pressure might be affecting us in our everyday lives, right? Something to think about. Until next time, dive safe. Okay, so we were just talking about how even oxygen, which we need to survive, can become toxic at certain depths.
It's true. It seems counterintuitive, but it's a prime example of how the underwater environment throws us curveballs.
So, for those of us who haven't quite reached those depths yet, can you explain what happens? How can the very thing we need to breathe become harmful?
It all boils down to partial pressure, just like with nitrogen. As we descend and the pressure increases, the partial pressure of oxygen in our bodies also goes up.
So the deeper we go, the more oxygen is essentially forced into our system.
In a way, yes. At a certain point, that pressure, that increased partial pressure of oxygen, reaches a level where it becomes toxic.
And for most recreational divers, this isn't something we need to worry about, right? We stick to shallower depths.
Exactly. Oxygen toxicity is more of a concern for technical divers who venture much deeper. Those depths change the game completely.
So what are we talking about here? How deep do you have to go for oxygen to become a problem?
Generally, oxygen toxicity becomes a concern at depth greater than 56 meters. That's far beyond recreational diving limits.
Okay, good to know. But it's still fascinating, even if it doesn't affect most divers.
So, for those who do dive to those extreme depths, what actually happens when oxygen becomes toxic? What are the risks?
The biggest concern is what's called central nervous system oxygen toxicity, or CNS toxicity for short. It can manifest in different ways. Visual disturbances, ear ringing, nausea, even seizures in severe
It
cases.
sounds pretty scary. It's serious stuff, no doubt. And it's why technical divers take so many precautions. They use specialized gas mixtures with a lower percentage of oxygen to mitigate those risks.
So it's all about managing those partial pressures very, very carefully.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and it highlights why understanding the science behind diving is crucial. It's not just a fun recreational activity. There's a lot of science at play to keep us safe.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, I've learned a ton today about nitrogen, oxygen, and how our bodies react to the underwater world. It's amazing how much there is to learn.
It's a constant learning experience, which is one of the things that makes diving so fascinating. There's always something new to discover.
So true. Before we wrap up this deep dive into the world of diving science, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from our conversation?
I think the most important thing is to remember that knowledge is power, especially when it comes to diving. Understanding how our bodies react to different depths, how gases behave under pressure, that's what keeps us safe.
Well said. And on that note, we'll surface from this deep dive, but keep those brains engaged, listeners. We've talked a lot about how pressure changes affect us underwater, but what about on dry land? Ever flown in an airplane or hiked up a mountain and felt that pressure in your ears? Makes you think, right? How else do these pressure changes, these seemingly small shifts, affect us in our everyday lives? Something to ponder. Until next time, dive safe, everyone.